Let's take a few minutes to talk about how we got here. Nearly 2 years ago, I started a YouTube channel to inject my voice into a cultural conversation that I'd been following for a long time. I wanted to do it in a way that nobody else had, and since I was fresh off my first year of college, I thought about tackling the subject from an academic angle. I created a character called the Reality Weasel, an idealized version of myself that amplified all the things I wanted to be. Knowledgeable, articulate, incisive, scholarly. I began to attack a burgeoning social movement, what I called the social justice movement, by looking to history, to biology, and to philosophy to reveal its flaws. I called the social justice movement many things. Dangerous, authoritarian, nihilistic, simplistic, coddling, groupish, religious. But there was one thing I never called it. Wrong. Perhaps I was more interested in flexing my intellectual muscles. Perhaps I was more invested in connecting lofty ideas from multiple fields to show how horrendous social justice could be for a society, or for an individual mind. Perhaps I didn't think it was necessary to take the time to explain why the foundational assumptions of social justice, in its current incarnation, were factually incorrect. The movement seemed so obviously ludicrous to me that I didn't even think to deconstruct it at its most basic level. But how the times have changed. As I get older and step out of my college bubble to interact with ordinary, intelligent, well-meaning people with jobs and homes and families, I find that we may not have been quick enough on the draw. Despite my best efforts, and the best efforts of everyone involved in this conversation, the ideas of social justice have continued to infect mainstream society. One no longer has to be a dyed-in-the-wool Marxist ideologue cooked up in the halls of American academia to fall victim to it. The phrase white privilege has become a mainstay of the well-to-do household. The language of oppression is being tossed around like candy by those who have no sense of the concept's immense gravity. It has become a casual talking point to brush aside notions of liberty, individualism, and democracy because people genuinely believe that we live in a system founded upon tyranny. And even without the crazy social justice warriors shutting down speakers or beating people up in the streets, the belief that the primary cause of black destitution is systemic racism now permeates the mainstream left. The mainstream has caught on to the perpetually offended campus snowflakes, the radical anarcho-communists, and the violent Antifa movement. But what they fail to understand is that our fundamental problem with the left is not the excesses of the activist class. Our fundamental problem is that the base assumptions of this class are factually wrong. But, after maturing as a person for the last 2 years, I think I've gained enough awareness to understand why so many people eat these ideas up so quickly. Because to the untrained eye, they appear to be correct. I grew up in the American South, among the most impoverished places in the country for minority groups. If you're being intellectually honest, you cannot avoid the plight of these communities. Riddled with poverty, crime, drugs, guns, violence, imprisonment, absent fathers, defunct education, unemployment, heightened police presence, crumbling infrastructure, and stagnant social mobility, the ghettoized communities of black and brown Americans face these problems far disproportionately to their white counterparts. It would seem almost instinctual, then, to think that something concerted and nefarious has occurred to produce such a horrendous outcome with such a massive disparity. That racism, the likes of which we saw in the Jim Crow era, has placed non-white communities into the dire straits they find themselves in. And you know what? I accept that there are dire straits. I accept that there are problems in this country that can be drawn along racial lines. But let's get a few things straight. I will never call this oppression. I will never call this systemic racism, and I will never agree that discrimination, privilege, or any kind of foul play is the cause of it. I'm concerned with getting to the bottom of these problems so that we can move forward and fix them, so let me make this clear from a classical liberal to all the progressives watching, I am willing to work with you, but you have to be more clear thinking about the nature of these problems and how people in society actually operate, and that's what I'm here for. So let this be a shift in my work. Let this be my first attempt to actually start a dialogue. Let this be my best effort to reach across the aisle and find some common ground with my intellectual opponents. Let this be the product of my maturation. Let this be the shedding of my scholarly veneer, and in its place the sincere words of a concerned citizen. And let this be the last time I have to address this topic as I carefully deconstruct the very foundation of the progressive school of thought. Ladies and gentlemen, I present to you everything wrong with identity politics. It may seem no small task to dismantle a system of thought that currently has a stranglehold on nearly every political, academic, and cultural institution of mainstream America, and on the entirety of the modern West in general, but to be perfectly honest, I don't think it takes that much. I don't need to reference statistics, or ethics, or historical consequences. I barely need to draw anything from external sources because identity politics cannot even stand on its own internal logic. But before I can prove that, we need to first define the argument. Now, just as I asked my opponents to take my ideas in good faith, I have to hold up my end of the bargain and do the same. So allow me to do some steel manning here. Not leveling any moral judgment against the argument, just presenting the argument as it stands. Here's the progressive position. That white people, through centuries of oppressing and exploiting non-whites, have accumulated an abundance of material and social capital to the detriment of those they have oppressed. As a result, white people occupy a higher rung on the socio-economic ladder than non-whites, hence the phenomenon of white privilege. If left unchecked, the capital of whites will continue to accumulate because whites, by virtue of their privilege, have continuous access to resources like education, healthcare, and employment prospects, while non-whites remain in relative poverty due to the dearth of resources available to them. This disparity does not necessarily require discrimination against non-whites, but occurs naturally in a self-perpetuated vicious cycle. This is what we call systemic racism, or structural racism, and is distinct from individual prejudice or bigotry. Therefore, to correct for the imbalance in resources and ensure a decent standard of living for all individuals, we necessarily and deliberately have to elevate non-whites into places of better socioeconomic standing, or at the very least enable them to elevate themselves. However, because there is a finite amount of resources available to the entire population, the promotion of individual minorities must come at the exclusion of individual whites, which is just because, again, white individuals have a disproportionate amount of privilege that must be undermined to ensure the equal standing and equal benefits of whites and non-whites. For example, affirmative action policies or racial quotas to ensure equal representation of the different races in academia, industry, and entertainment. And this is how we define identity politics: the creation of policies that target specific demographics to cater to their collective group interests. Alright, everybody got that? Great, now let's smash it to bits. We're going to explore identity politics with a concept called the privilege ladder. It's a general measure of how well off a certain person or group of people is in society, where this rung at the top is really, really good, and this bottom rung is utter shit. Now, this is what the ladder looks like to a progressive, and if this were true, then the identity politicians might have a point. Black people are inherently disadvantaged, so they need a leg up. But in truth, the ladder looks like this. Yes, white people still mostly occupy the upper rungs, but some of them are right down there in Schitt's Creek with the blacks. So the sum total of all privilege held by white people is higher, but that doesn't mean that all the white people in that group inherently possess that privilege. Whites make up the majority of the top economic bracket, yes, but that doesn't mean that the entire population of white people is any better off for it. Whites make up the majority of Congress, yes, but that doesn't mean that the white demographic automatically has any more political clout than any other group in a representative democracy. To use an example from economics, a country's GDP can be massive, but that may be because a handful of absurdly wealthy corporations are generating most of the country's income, while vast swathes of its population are left impoverished and destitute. So the statement, white people are more privileged than black people, may be true in aggregate. That is, if we're comparing sum to sum, group to group, country to country, but it doesn't mean that these white people are more privileged than these black people, or that this white person is more privileged than this black person. Fundamentally, the argument for identity politics comes down to a misreading of statistics. You recognize a trend, but then mistakenly extrapolate that trend to encompass all the people involved. We have a word for this, it's called stereotyping. The data predict that privileged people will tend to be white, not that white people will be inherently privileged. And is this inequality an injustice? No, not necessarily. One person being better off than another person, or even one group being better off than another group, is not an injustice in itself. My life is no worse for the fact that Bill Gates makes more money in a year than I ever will in 10 lifetimes. Inequality in itself is not a problem. What is a problem is that countless black communities are so far down on this ladder that they're stuck in the absolute dregs of society, and if we want to solve that problem, then we have to target the source rather than the outcome. We shouldn't be focusing on shrinking the gap between white and black, because the gap is only the outcome. The gap is not the cause. The supposed privilege of whites is not the cause. So what is the cause? Progressives say that the cause is oppression, at the hand of a system that places whites in a supreme position to minorities on the socioeconomic ladder. This is what they call white supremacy. This is what they call racism. Words that used to describe a prejudicial or bigoted state of mind, but now describe a series of vicious socioeconomic cycles that will perpetually hold black communities down if left without intervention. It would seem, then, that we don't need to worry about the actions of white people at all if the source of the problem is simply internal economic dynamics, but progressives can never seem to remain consistent on this point. On the one hand, they'll say that the source of oppression is white-on-black discrimination, that America is irredeemably prejudiced, full of implicit and explicit racial bias, and that our institutions of justice, education, and finance are packed to the brim with secret bigots who subsist on the destitution of minorities. On the other hand, though, they'll say that oppression would exist regardless of individual prejudices because the system operates on its own. They'll say that you could be the wokest, most race-conscious person on the face of the planet and you would still be called racist because you didn't do anything to dismantle the system of oppression. And I'm not going to say that this contradiction ruins the argument. Progressives, I'm going to give you the benefit of the doubt and concede that, perhaps, both could be true at the same time. I'm not going to back you into a corner and make you pick one or the other. Instead, I'm going to debunk them both. If the root of all evil is discrimination at the hands of individual white people, even if those people control our institutions, it is still not a justification to abrogate the opportunities or benefits of whites, even if they profit from that discrimination, as progressives suggest. Let's use the example of gainful employment, which progressives say is tarnished by implicit bias because employers are less likely to admit someone if their name is coded as being African American. They frequently cite studies backing this up, so let's suppose that it's true. If the disproportionate amount of white employment compared to black employment is caused by discrimination, then the answer is not to give preference to black applicants in order to shrink the gap. The answer is to remove the person or the policy doing the discriminating. The white applicants never asked for special treatment. They didn't demand that employers discriminate in favor of them over black applicants. The actions of the white applicants are completely detached from those of the employer. The white applicants are not discriminating against black applicants, and you cannot penalize them for something that they haven't done. And as soon as we bring up these objections, you will inevitably shift the goalposts. You'll say, it's not about individual prejudice, it's about institutional power, it's about the system. You have to cut down on white representation to fix the system. So let's move on to the system, shall we? I'd sooner admit that the problem really is the system than I'd admit that the problem is individual prejudice. I'm more than willing to admit that people already living in poverty don't have access to the resources of social mobility, that they'll stay in poverty, and that their children will be born into poverty, starting the cycle all over again. This is not the product of malice, this is just the way the world works. I think you'll agree with me there. But if this is the case, then this is an even greater argument against identity politics. If the system exists as a layer over individual action, then cutting down on white representation in our institutions doesn't actually fix the system, it only screws over the people who are subject to it. You can't say that oppression is caused by a system that operates independently of human action, and then turn around and penalize individual people as though discrimination, a human action, were at play. You can't have it both ways, and if you want to argue that the system really is the problem, then you can't call it oppression. Oppression by nature requires intent. It cannot be accomplished without an oppressor deliberately stomping his boot down on the face of society. You want to point to institutions and call them oppressive, rather than point to individuals and call them discriminatory, but you seem to forget that institutions cannot function without an individual at the helm. So you'll say that it was discrimination in the past that got us to where we are now, that it was slavery, that it was Jim Crow, but discrimination in the past is not the same as discrimination now. Benefiting from a system is not the same as creating it or even enabling it. It is, as you so often say, simply the situation we were born into through no choice of our own. But in the same moment that you say that none of us had any choice in the way things turned out, you act as though we did. You act as though white people today are responsible for the sins of their ancestors. You seek to undermine the benefits of white people in order to put whites and blacks on equal footing in the socioeconomic ladder. Your actions become an exercise in revenge, in which the blood spilled in past injustices can only be made right by spilling an equal amount of blood in the present. And you rationalize this by thinking, well, whites benefit the most from this oppressive system, so we can lay the blame for oppression at the feet of whites who have never done anything to put down minorities in their entire lives. And to all the white people in my audience, these are the word games the progressive left wants to play with you. They want to paint you and your quote-unquote dominant group as the beneficiaries of an oppressive system and thereby make you the oppressor. If your group benefits from the outcome of systemic racism, then you are a racist. Because to them, that's all you are, a representative of your demographic. You are merely a brick in the wall, a component and enabler of the system, and so removing you from the equation is the same action as dismantling the system, as fixing the root of the problem. After all, you cannot separate white people from the system of whiteness. Progressives will tell you that their ideology isn't about blaming white people, that you as a white person should not feel threatened by their prescriptions for justice. This is a lie. You should absolutely feel threatened because in a world where progressive policies are being realized more and more by the day in academic, corporate, entertainment, and political institutions, the threat is very real. And progressives, I'm talking to you again. This may be a lie that you're simply unaware of telling. You may even be unaware that you're lying to yourselves. But if we're going to move forward on this issue, then you have to be honest about what you're doing and the kind of world you want to see. I won't throw the charge of bad faith at you, but I want you to know from the bottom of my heart that from an outside perspective, your agenda looks like a justification and exercise of your own prejudices against white people. And even if you had no such prejudices before you got introduced to this line of thought, you have to own the fact that it will eventually lead you to bitterness, resentment, and aggression towards those you perceive as your oppressors. And most of all, you have to realize that your idea of justice is not about lifting downtrodden individuals into prosperity, but about striking white people down to reduce the disparity between whites and blacks in aggregate, and it's not going to help one bit. You can restrict the number of positions white people are allowed to hold and instead leave them open for minorities. You can get more black people in Congress, you can get more black people into college, you can produce more black CEOs, you can get more black people in lead acting roles, you can nominate more black people for Oscars, you can make all of these token gestures of inclusion and representation and call it progress. You can put a handful of black people on equal footing with their white counterparts and put black people as a class higher up on the social ladder. But how many black people are going to be the direct beneficiaries of those policies? A few thousand, tops? Guess how many black people that leaves. You recognize that minorities might not have gotten a fair shake in America, but you focus all your efforts at the highest echelons of mainstream American society while doing virtually nothing to solve poverty or unemployment or crime. It's equivalent to allowing a handful of wealthy corporations to produce the bulk of a country's GDP, reading that we have a booming economy, and then thinking that all of the country's citizens are doing extremely well for themselves. You view the world so rigidly in terms of class interests that you neglect the suffering of the individuals who make up those classes, both the black individuals left at the bottom of society and the white individuals that you target in your so-called pursuit of justice. This is what leads you to promote minorities at the expense of people who have nothing to do with the misfortune of the oppressed. Whites are not simply cogs in an oppressive machine. They are human beings with the same desires, aspirations, and basic necessities for life as any person of color. And your failure to recognize our shared humanity is how you rationalize violating the humanity of others when you yourself would justifiably cling to that humanity with your dying breath. Your agenda is petty, vindictive, myopic, unjust, and just factually wrong. But, to bring it all back to the beginning, I am willing to work with you. Because ultimately, I think we want the same things. We want a more equitable society where we can maximize the total amount of human flourishing. And you know why else I think we're natural allies? Because I am willing to admit that the problems faced by minority communities are systemic. There are unfortunately those in my political camp who would have you believe that these problems can solely be attributed to a failure of personal responsibility en masse, that the individuals in these communities were too lazy or too complacent or too dumb to lift themselves up out of their abysmal conditions. But the fact that these problems are so severe and so widespread among populations that have had undeniably harrowing pasts in this country, this cannot be mere coincidence. I am fully willing to admit that there is likely some larger force at work here, whether it be political, economic, cultural, coming from outside these communities or from within them. But progressives, if we're going to figure out what that force is and work together to fix it, then you absolutely must abandon the enterprise of identity politics. You must be honest about the nature of these problems and understand that whiteness or white privilege is not to blame for them, as I have so carefully explained in this video. You must stop reducing the complexities of social dynamics to a monolithic class relationship between oppressor and oppressed. You must stop denying variability in individual well-being, and must stop assigning uniform interests to vast swathes of people. You must stop conflating individual prosperity with group benefits, and individuals with the supposed system they operate under. And you must stop inferring injustice or nefarious agendas every time you spot a disparity in our society. Because, in short, people are different from each other, and inferring all their thoughts, beliefs, wants, and social position because they look the same is bound to end in disaster when you begin to treat them as the monolith that you perceive them to be. But I think that this tendency to reduce our personhood and our motives to our skin color goes deeper than mere ignorance or petty malice. I think it arises from something deeply flawed within the conscience of identity politicians. A kind of failure, not only a moral one, but a spiritual one of sorts. And if we want to cross this impasse once and for all, move forward as partners, and actually do some good in this world, then I think this deficiency needs to be pointed out. And after that, it's up to the individual to decide if they want to sort it out within themselves. But for that, you'll have to wait until part 2.